When a balloon 60,000 feet in the air threatened the relationship between two superpowers, the world took notice. When 3 more were found, the stakes grew exponentially. Today, we hear from KT McFarland, who worked with Henry Kissinger, Caspar Weinberger, and 4 United States presidents about what all this means and how it could lead to something far more dangerous. From Ballard Studios, it's time for 13th and Park.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted.
There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
We will make America strong again.
We will get through this together.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Well, KT, it's so great to have you on the show today with my co-host, Justin Safey. There is so much to talk about. Justin, take it away.
Great. KT, thanks again. Great to have you on the show. Talk to us about what your belief is, what the Chinese government was doing with the balloon that was ultimately shot down off the coast of South Carolina, and whether you have a theory as to what these other identified objects may be and their purpose.
I think the Chinese understood that we had a vulnerability in our detection abilities. And what the Chinese have done in the last several years is they've engaged in a massive military buildup. I mean, we haven't seen this kind of a buildup since before World War I, before Nazi Germany, before the Japanese military buildup, before World War II. So they've had this massive military buildup. The part that they've really focused on is intercontinental ballistic missiles. In other words, missiles that can go from China all the way around the world to the United States carrying nuclear weapons. And they now are on track to have more of these intercontinental ballistic missiles than the United States. So what all these surveillance devices are, I think, is to really map the United States, particularly around American military facilities, probably around critical infrastructure facilities, so that it gives them a target list if they are ever going to go to war using nuclear weapons.
Americans can only imagine the Situation Room, the White House Situation Room, and what they must be going through, what they were going through when the first object was detected and ultimately shot down. What is the right way to handle this kind of situation, and maybe what the wrong way is?
Okay, the right way to handle the situation is kind of divided into 2. Number 1, find out what's going on right now, what action should you take immediately? And then number 2 is to take a step back and say, well, what does this mean? What's the bigger picture here, and what should our bigger response be? So let's go back to part number 1. Okay, we didn't know that there were these spy balloons up there. Again, I think we failed to understand that they were there until after they were already in the United States airspace. And then we had to scramble to figure out, what are they? What are we going to do? We're going to shoot them down. How are we going to shoot them down? We weren't prepared for this. This was a hole in our detection capability. So once they figured out what it was, then they got the plan of, okay, we're going to shoot it down, but we're not sure quite where. A lot of their decision-making at this point was driven by public relations, because prior to this, even when they first detected it, they weren't letting the American people know. And they had a planned trip of Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was supposed to go to China. So once the Biden administration understood what was going on, then I think they were still going to have that meeting. They were kind of, well, maybe it'll transit the United States. We're not going to make that big a deal about it. But then when the people in Montana looked up in the air, I mean, and that's how they initially found it, is by the naked eye in Montana. Then there was an outcry, both political parties in the United States, the American people. I mean, anybody can understand when you look up in the air and you see something spying on you, that's time to take action. So it's important for the Biden administration, really everybody, to take this step back and say, we've been caught flat-footed. So what are they really all about? And then what should our response be? Now, I think our response is pretty clear, that we must understand that China is in this Cold War with the United States, and the United States needs to very quickly and very comprehensively come up with a strategy for dealing with this, like we did in the Reagan administration with the Soviet Union.
And KT, I want to ask you what you think the elements of that strategy that you think the United States needs to quickly come up with is part 1 of the question. And part 2, do you see that there's any other outcome other than an inevitable conflict between the United States and China? Because it seems like the relationship is deteriorated significantly over the last several years, and it's hard to see that there's any other path other than continued deterioration.
Let me answer your second question first. Yes, I do definitely think there's another path here other than confrontation. And that's why I want to take the initial part of your question and say, okay, so what do we do now to prevent us getting to the point where the only option is capitulation or war? What I would do is to say, looking back at what the Reagan administration did, number one, rebuild the American defenses. Number two, we cornered the high tech market in the 1980s. We had twice as much spending, for example, on research and development as we do today. As a result of the spending that we did in the 1980s, in not just pure research, but military research, it not only spurred our economy, but it put the United States in an economic superiority for 20 years. So what could we do today? Well, I think we should double our spending on research and development. I think we should incentivize corporations and companies and research institutions to come up with the next technologies of the future. What is the internet of the future? What are computers of the future? To do that, to spend, and there's very specific areas where the Chinese are already there. They're already spending this money. They're already stealing our stuff. But areas where we could really double down and we would be very successful quite quickly. And it would be things like quantum computing, artificial intelligence, robotics, bioengineering. There are a whole bunch of things where we're good, but China's catching up, and in some cases, China's better. For example, in hypersonic weapons, we don't have those. We've been spending a lot of money fighting the forever wars in the Middle East, but we haven't developed hypersonic weapons. China has. Then the third thing is that we understood that the United States and our economy and our system of government would ultimately prevail and that the communist system will ultimately fail. But we hurried it along a little bit. And the way we hurried it along was using the economic weapon that we had, or the economic power we had. We shut Russia out of the international banking system. So when they needed to ultimately borrow money, they couldn't. We can do a lot of that same thing with China, with China's access to capital and to the access of the international banking system. But then finally, the thing that really made the ultimate difference, I think, in the Cold War was that the United States understood that our great advantage is having alliances and like-minded nations who will act as we did. In the Reagan years, we had Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, but we had the European community, the Germany especially, and now we have Japan, we have Korea, we have the Philippines, potentially even India. We could form economic alliances with them, trade alliances, but we can also form security alliances with them. So all those things together, the United States maintains this technological edge. But the cherry on the top, the final thing that we have that nobody else has, is energy independence. And so we have the ability to become the new power center, the United States, Canada, and Mexico together. We have the ability to be the energy hub of the world for the next 100 years. Not only do our companies make money at a very, $50 a barrel for oil, the Russians can't do it for $50 a barrel. Nobody can do it because they're using their oil and natural gas revenues to pay for everything else. So what we could do, shove the price of oil and natural gas down. That solves a lot of our problems in the Middle East. It bankrupts Russia. There goes that war in Ukraine. The Russians won't be able to afford it. But most importantly, with regard to China, China is the most energy needy country in the world, and it's the country with the lousiest energy natural resources. So we could then be in a very strong position with regard to China.
Let's talk about Taiwan. When we saw the visit not so long ago of then Speaker Pelosi going to Taiwan, and the nervousness about whether she was actually going to make it there safely, whether her plane was going to be shot out of the air or not, as the Chinese on the mainland were kind of saber rattling. It did bring into focus how important Taiwan is. And because of the situation in Ukraine, some are now suggesting that a possible invasion of Taiwan could be nigh. Cue clip.
So what all did President Xi have to say about this, and how's Taiwan responding?
Well, he signaled, Rosemary, or at least seemed to signal in his opening remarks at China's Communist Party Congress, that within his reign of power, reunification with Taiwan will happen. And while he says he is hoping for a peaceful reunification of the island that he and previous Chinese leaders have never actually controlled, the way that it's being read by many people around the world, including here in Taiwan, is that China is planning very intensively for a military takeover.
So, KT, a military takeover, how imminent could that be? Are we looking at something that could happen sooner rather than later?
Oh, yeah. I think Xi Jinping has made it pretty clear that his goal is to, quote, unify China, bring Taiwan under Chinese domination, and to do it within his lifetime. Now, he's in his early 70s, so you do the math. He really wants to have that happen within the next 10 years, probably within the next 5 years. That's why the Chinese have rebuilt. They've built up this very strong military. So why do they want Taiwan? I mean, part of it is they want historic bragging rights. So Taiwan is part of China, just like Hong Kong is part of China. They also, though, and you pointed this out, and this is key, nobody's really focused on this. They want Taiwan because they want to control the international chip market. 95% of the world's microprocessors come from Taiwan. We invent them in the United States. Taiwan makes them. And it's everything from running your television to your car, to your radio, all of your communications devices, probably even your coffee machine. So Taiwan is a critical economic asset for China. And then in the third part is that China wants to dominate the Western Pacific. We call it the South China Sea area. Sort of think of Hawaii and West. China wants to dominate that, and they can do that if they have control of Taiwan. So that's their goal. And they've said, well, we don't want to have to do it militarily, but if that's what it takes, we'll do it. So again, what should our response be? First of all, the critical supply chain. Stuff like pharmaceuticals, chips, all the stuff that really makes our modern society work, we need to either bring back to the United States to manufacture or make sure that it's no longer in China, but it's in the manufacturing jurisdiction of our pals, Europe, Japan, Korea, et cetera. So we can't be subject to their blackmail. For example, during the early days of COVID, when President Trump, and I was the Deputy National Security Advisor, my office was, 50 feet from the president's, and he would constantly call it the China virus or Wu flu. He had all sorts of names, but they all had China in them. And so the Chinese got in touch with President Trump and they said, stop that. If you do this, if you make it like it's our virus, we're going to cut off antibiotics to the United States. And since China makes something like 75, 80% of the component parts of antibiotics, we wouldn't have had any amoxicillin for the next year or two. So the Chinese understand that that gives them enormous blackmail power. And we don't want them to have that power, right? So we should be reshoring, it's called, or nearshoring all of those things that are critical for our infrastructure, for our health, and for our national security.
If we follow that recommendation that you have in terms of how the U.S. should go forward in dealing with China, it seems to me, and there's this concept that people have termed it decoupling of China and its allies from the United States and its allies economically, somewhat diplomatically. Do you see that as an inevitable outcome between China and the United States, that the U.S. and its allies, it's say China, Russia, Iran, and their other are forming a new axis of competition amongst allies?
Yeah, I think they're definitely forming that axis. What does Russia have? It has natural resources and it has weapon systems. What does China have? Technology and money. So the Chinese look at that situation and say, gee, a China-Russia alliance with China's technological ability, China's money, and trading blackmail power, plus Russia's natural resources and Russia's advanced weapon systems, that's pretty powerful. I mean, I think the United States, all the wargaming that the Pentagon is now doing of, say, a war game between the United States and China over Taiwan, we lose every one of those. Mm-hmm. So the idea that Russia and China together standing up to a sole United States, this is not a scenario we want to look at. It was certainly a war we can't win, and it's not a war we want to have. That's why I think our allies are very important.
Should America's allies be doing more to support the United States and its foreign policy goals vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia? Or are you satisfied with the response of the allies and being part of the Western coalition of Western democracies?
Justin, they should double what they're doing, and then they should double it again. For decades, we've been going to our NATO partners and we've said to them, look, we're spending 2% of our GNP on our military. You ought to do the same. And they've always said, well, not now. This is an inconvenient time. Our economy isn't terrific. Oh, there's no threat. Russia's no problem. And so they haven't done it. Now, Ukraine has woken everybody up to the situation. So other countries initially said, oh, now we're going to do our 2%. But they're falling back on it. They're not quite doing it. Yeah, if you want to be our friend, you better ante up because you have the resources. Why should we be running deficits? You guys are running surpluses and we're defending you. There's something wrong with that.
So, KT, of all the things out there under the foreign policy umbrella, what keeps you up at night?
China, China, China. Not that we can't deal with this Chinese threat. We could deal with the Soviet Union in the 1980s. We can deal with the Chinese threat, but only if the United States, of both political parties, wakes up to it, acknowledges it, and takes the steps to deal with it. Now, I'm looking at those balloons and devices, or whatever you want to call them, and I think that was a real wake-up call for the United States. We need to have a comprehensive plan, a whole of government approach, and frankly, a whole of society approach. If we're not willing to do that, kiss it goodbye. China becomes the dominant power in the world, and we never get that back. We never get our freedoms back. We never get our ability to have a strong economy and a secure way of life for our children. It doesn't come back once we lose it. Now, I do think we have a window, but it's narrowing every single day. And so I'm hoping that our national leadership, and I'm certainly going to scream about it with my hair on fire until people start paying attention, is that we should focus on the Chinese threat, and this other silly stuff, it'll take care of itself. But China doesn't take care of itself unless we act.
We had the 9/11 attacks on 9/11/2001, an attack on the homeland. We had 2 million people apprehended at the southern border of the United States last year, more than ever before in history. We have Chinese airships, devices traversing the United States that the Department of Defense, which we have over $700 billion of taxpayer dollars, and also borrowing money from the Chinese to pay for that defense, unable to detect things flying over United airspace, surveilling targets within the United States. What confidence can an American citizen have that the U.S. government is able to protect the homeland after those 3 significant failures?
I think that my confidence is certainly really eroded in it. China understands you destroy a society from without and from within. Right. The way you destroy it from without, obviously, is weapons and trade and economic. The way you destroy it from within, though, is it eats at itself. So, for example, the Chinese are making all the fentanyl that's coming over our border and killing. Fentanyl, kid-killing drugs, especially in the Midwest. So that's how you destroy a society from within. You destroy a society within, especially a democracy, by having us all at each other. Well, social media, the Chinese are using social media to sort of amplify the angriness in our voices. So the Chinese understand, they know that democracy and a free market system is pretty potent. And they understand that the soft underbelly and our weakness is that we'll all scramble at each other and we'll lose track of what the main adversary is. So to me, that, understand that Chinese threat, stop screaming at each other over it, and figure out what steps are we going to take. So maybe the Democrats, they're not as worried about Confucius Institutes at university campuses as maybe Republicans are. Okay, how about meet in the middle? How about cut half of it off? Or if you're on Wall Street, one of the things that nobody talks about, if you want to list a stock, and I'm sure that people who listen to this show watch it because they do get involved in investing. If you want to list a stock on the New York Stock Exchange, you have to go through all sorts of hoops and show your money and the money trail and lots of accounting, and people are crawling all over you for regulations. If you're a Chinese company, guess what? You don't have to do any of that stuff. How about at least at a minimum, having Chinese companies play by American rules?
I want to close by asking you a question about someone I'm very fond of, and of course you are too, your daughter, Fiona. She said to me before the podcast, she said, I remember watching or meeting 4-star generals and admirals or whatever through mom. Who has that kind of dinner table experience? She said that she really kind of got the bug for public service and the need to give back from mom. As a graduate of the Naval Academy who served on a surface battle warship for a number of years and then in the Pentagon. And now you see Fiona in the Florida legislature. She was elected as a member of the House a couple of years ago. How important is it? First of all, how proud are you of Fiona as her mom? And how important is it that we have young leaders like that who have that kind of military and foreign policy experience to be able to address the issues we know are right ahead?
See, this is, I think, at the end of the day, what makes me maybe stay up at night but go back to sleep happy, is because I realize that next generation of leaders, when my daughter ran for the Florida State House, I thought she was nuts to go into politics. She had a terrific career in the economic community and consulting, and prior to that, she's still a Naval Reserve officer. So why does she want to go into politics? And she said, well, I need to feel like I'm giving back to my country. We've had a lot. Our family's been pretty blessed over the years, and she wants to give back. So through her, and watching her run for office and then go up to Tallahassee and help legislate, I met all these young people, especially in the Republican Party, and they're not old folks like us, Adam and Justin. They're young and they're excited and they're energetic and no challenge is too big. And they're female and they're military veterans and they're Black and they're Hispanic and they're Asian. The future is really terrific. My generation, the baby boom generation, I think we got a lot of stuff wrong. But I look at the next generation coming up. I think they're going to be another greatest generation in the United States. So I get nervous in the middle of the night and I wake up, but I go to bed and sleep thinking it's people like my daughter who are going to be running the country for the next 30 years. And that keeps me very, very content and happy.
For all those who are watching this telecast, right behind KT are two naval swords, one belonging to Fiona and the other to her husband, also a Navy veteran, Matt. That's got to make you terribly proud.
Yeah, I am very proud. I'm proud of all 5 of our kids. But the idea that Fiona stepped up to, often not very rewarding in the sense of getting public acclaim for public service, but I really admire her for doing it. And I'm going to do everything I can to help her succeed. And I'm sure she will.
We really thank you, KT, for everything you've done for the country over so many years in so many ways. And I think your message about China is basically wake up. We got to deal with this now. Things aren't getting easier or better, and it won't until we get our arms around it and figure out how, as a nation, we're ready to move forward.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And thank you both for the opportunity to be on with you.
Well, Adam, I know we've had a lot of great episodes of 13th and Park, but this definitely ranks up there as one of the best. KT has a wealth of experience working at the highest levels of the U.S. government, dealing with a lot of foreign policy issues. I was struck by a number of things, but obviously when you asked her what keeps her up at night, she had 3 answers: China, China, and China. And she had some specific solutions about what the U.S. government needs to do immediately. And part 1 of that was to begin to be able to have enough production capabilities in the United States for essential items like antibiotics, for instance.
When she went to school, she was a graduate of MIT. She also studied at Oxford. She focused on China, Russia, and nuclear weapons. Now, go way back, right? That's interesting that those are the 3 things she chose decades ago to focus on. And those 3 things are still, front and center. I think when she made the point about critical assets, and we talked about Taiwan and how critical it is, I didn't understand that 95% of these computer chips, microchips, are coming from Taiwan. That says it all. We could be squeezed and have no recourse.
Absolutely. And that puts us in a very vulnerable position. Related to that, on the flip side of that coin, is what, again, we know, but I didn't reflect upon how important it was. As she said, the one thing that we have that no one else has is energy independence. And she really emphasized how important that was. China doesn't have that. And they're one of the most, I think she said, one of the most energy dependent countries in the world, which I think is leading to that alliance between Russia and China, a strengthening of that alliance there. So I think that we have to continue to make sure that we leverage our own assets that we have. We need to bring the manufacturing onshore and nearshore, and then also not squander a natural advantage that we have in terms of our natural resources.
Well, it's very clear that China, they're focused on domination. I think KT used that word. Right. Economic domination, military domination. You see the rapid expansion of the Chinese Navy to a size that I think is almost, if not already above America's. Their increasing aggressiveness in the South China Sea and their investments abroad. We had, a show with former Ambassador Pham talking about Africa and natural resources and how China is so ingrained themselves throughout the continent, and a continent that's full of the kind of strategic resources that are necessary to drive the future. You put all those together and you say, we got a problem, right? And the question is where to start. And when you talk foreign policy, Justin, it's easy to say, well, there are 18 things to talk about in 18 countries. She got very focused very quickly here and said, start and end right now with China. Don't make it more complicated so we can figure out how to deal with that. A lot of other things can start falling into place. If we don't figure that out, They won't.
They won't. And it's interesting because she talked about how cultures or countries get defeated from without and from within. She talked about that bilateral strategy that exists. And two questions I posed to her were really about the within part, because the world and also the United States is experiencing what commonly referred to as populism. And it doesn't seem like the border is under control. The fact that balloons are flying over U.S. airspace that are being detected by people in Wyoming, they're looking up into the sky and seeing that the Defense Department doesn't even know about these things, didn't know how to deal with it until now all of a sudden. And also related to that, the fact that she doesn't think that which I agree with, that the European allies of the United States aren't doing enough to carry their load to protect the way of life that we call democracy. Those are all things that, with the exception of the balloon, that Donald Trump exploited during his presidential campaigns. The immigration issues, the failure to support the border, made a big deal out of the fact that the European countries aren't carrying their share to protect the Western alliance. And those are the kinds of things, those failures, and I would put the 9/11 attack on that as well, reduce the confidence that people have in their government to do its most basic function, which is protect the homeland. And that continues to feed populism. So I just felt that it was interesting to hear her comments on that, and hopefully some of these issues will be addressed.
In terms of what keeps me up at night, other than my 11-month-old puppy, Millie, is wonderful. When she has to go, is that all these things flying overhead, that because of, it sounds like, better technology, we're now detecting maybe what's been up there for a while. Doesn't that worry you that there's stuff upstairs that is watching us, our every move, gaining intelligence that could be used against us?
Yeah, it's a big problem. I'm glad it's finally been detected, thanks to the people who lived in Montana who saw the balloon. And I think now we're going to be a safer country as a result of it. Although it's a little embarrassing to say that that's what it took. We spend $700 billion a year on defense. And the fact that she quickly conceded or agreed that this is a huge vulnerability in our ability to protect our homeland. So hopefully that will be safer as a result of it, and we'll have a more strategic approach to these types of events in the future.
Well, KT comes out of the Reagan years too, when the popularized phrases of peace through strength and trust but verify became part of the popular lexicon. I still think those are every bit as relevant today as they were then. By the way, a special shout out to Fiona McFarland, a young woman who came out of the military with her eyes on the stars and her feet on the ground. We need more people like that who are less political and more policy driven to find the answers that have been eluding a lot of us for a long time. Another great episode, and we look forward to doing more of these kinds of shows, delving into the real issues, not the politics of America, but the issues that will help define America moving forward.
Don't miss future episodes by following us on Apple, Spotify, or other podcast platforms, or go to the YouTube channel where you can subscribe for free.